dialed in here? So the first thing I'll say to everybody who's dialed in here is that I don't have anybody who's present with me in the room. So I don't have any feedback that is real time about how people are understanding what I'm saying or if there's any questions. And I also, since I can't see any of you, I don't have any feedback about whether any of you might want to ask questions. So while I'm going to try to pause as I go through, please don't hesitate to just interrupt me. That if you're not used to these conferences, it's really the only way to let whether you want to say something or have a question be known. So again, please do not hesitate to interrupt me about stuff. So today's topic is sort of an introduction to how to approach providing the reviewers of your grant and the funding agencies information about what sort of research you really want to do and what sort of questions you want to analyze. Now, this is a very basic introduction. As you go through the process of grant writing, that you're definitely going to have to take this sort of basic understanding and supplement this with a really sort of deep understanding of the philosophy, logic, and even the psychology of how to write in such a way to make your research come across as strong as possible. I'll try to touch on some of these things, and there's a number during this talk, and I think Erin has uploaded a number of attachments to the presentation that elaborates some of these ideas further. Now, one thing that I will let you note is that I'm not going to be emphasizing very much about the research per se. This is all about how to present your research effectively. And that's largely because the people who are listening to this are very wide range, from very basic scientists all the way to community health clinicians. And there are subtle differences in each field, and you should definitely get as much advice and input as possible. Now, the first thing that I want to emphasize, though, is that probably the most important thing you can do is get the first drafts of your research written up as early as possible, and then be able to put your ego aside and let your peers and your mentors have a chance to both seriously critique your grant and do it early enough that you can actually act on those criticisms. Because probably the biggest mistake that all investigators do, but particularly young investigators, is that they push the deadline. They don't finish their first draft soon enough to get any feedback. And why it's actually uncomfortable sometimes to give your work to a mentor who will then give you potentially very critical feedback. It's better to get that feedback locally when you have a chance to fix it quickly than it is to submit a grant and get the first opportunity to give a response to any feedback 9 months later. So writing these things and developing stuff weeks and actually preferably months prior to grant deadlines is a really, really important concept. So so I'll put that aside. Now, this particular presentation is not talking about any of the ancillary information in the grant. Actually, next month's presentation is going to be talking about all of the things outside of the research plan, which are extremely important for writing your grant. They're actually, in many cases, equally important, particularly for an early stage investigator, because you're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt about you as an investigator or your environment. So you do have to put a lot of attention to this. This is only about your research description. Now, the presentation is focused on NIH grants. However, much of what I'm going to say is also important for pretty much any granting agency you apply for. So with that, when you're writing your NIH grant, you actually have to write your research grant 4 times and present your work in 4 different ways. And those 4 times are the project summary, the public health relevance statement, the specific aims, and the research plan. Every single one of these 4 documents should largely be able to stand alone, because in many cases they will be reviewed by different audiences and for different purposes. So I'm going to walk through this in the order that these pieces are presented in the application when you submit it. The first of these is the project summary. Now, project summary is the public format of the grant. This is what the greater, if your grant is funded, this is what the greater world will see. So the audience, you can consider it the general public. This is that document that is posted publicly. Last week, we talked about NIH Reporter a lot. The project summaries are the information that you pull up in NIH Reporter. Now, from the standpoint of review, from the standpoint of NIH internally, the project summary may be the least important part. However, it is also very important to make sure you do it well. And the reason is that the readers can be the research community. These mean your peers. This means potential people who might hire you if you are on the job market. This could be your bosses in the hierarchy. It could be people who are looking for collaborators. So if you have a funded grant and I'm looking for a collaborator, this is the information that I can pull up on NIH Reporter. Do we have a question? Or, okay. So this is the information that I can pull up on NIH Reporter that tells me what you're working on. So, so you do want to have enough information that describes the scope of the proposed work. It's also the press gets this, NIH administrative staff. One thing to note, Congress and congressional aides see this. Another thing to keep in mind about the project summary, so a lot of this is sort of ancillary. You might feel it might not directly affect you. It's like, well, you have to write this, but it doesn't matter. But one place where it does matter is that if your grant is funded, or if it, let's say your grant is not funded, and you put in a revised application, the project summary is the piece that will carry over to the new application, because it is the description of the research that is put right on top of the summary statement. So somebody who is looking at your revised application, the project summary is the piece that tells them what it was on. Also, if you have a grant funded and it goes in for competing renewal, the reviewers of your competing renewal will see the summary statement from your prior award. And the project summary is largely the comprehensive description of that work. So that it will be read by reviewers, it just might not be emphasized by reviewers for the current application. Now, the format of a project summary is a standard abstract. I put in parentheses here an unstructured abstract because I know many people working in clinical fields have to write structured abstracts. This is the kind of abstract you would see probably in the vast majority of scientific papers. Now, some things to consider as you're writing your project summary. And I apologize that this is so busy, but you want to use most of this. The project summary is maybe half a page at the most. You want to use most of the space to describe the problem and emphasize why it is important. And this is true because these project summaries inform the world why NIH should be funded. Right this second, NIH funding is probably under unprecedented attack. That there are congressional staffers who are combing the NIH reporter database looking for so-called wasteful scientific funding. They're looking for things that are politically controversial or that they may look bad to the lay public. And this is because this is the only public information they have. So you want the project summary to make it really clear to the lay public or congressional staff or anybody who's looking for waste, fraud, and abuse in the scientific system that this is important research. There's an article that is, you can click through here, that's on the Proxmire Golden Fleece Award. When I was a young career scientist, William Proxmire was a senator who was very much attacking federally funded research for so-called silly things. One of the most high-profile things that he attacked was a researcher who studied what causes people and mice and animals to clench their jaws in when they're angry. Now, the way the abstracts that were in the public sphere were worded is that he was looking at jaw clenching. And Proxmire went after this as waste, fraud, and abuse. But what he was actually studying was very important information under the neuroscience of aggression. And because, though, the public abstract was so technical, that somebody reading it, it looked silly on the face, even though it was very, very important science to be funding. But the details were emphasized, not the big picture, why we care. And I would really encourage you to read this article from several years ago in The Scientist that really talks about the implications of it. I can tell you that the scientist in question really had better things to do with his time than defend his work against this. And even though it resolved that Proxmire had to pay damages to the scientist who made the accusation, that in the end, it did more harm for science because people don't remember the retractions or the apologies. They only remember the initial accusations. So you absolutely want to write your project summary focused on the important part of your work with less emphasis on the details of how you're using a model to study a big picture problem of importance. Another thing, for somewhat similar reasons, it's best to keep the description of the work to be performed quite vague. Some of this is that for the reasons that I just said, if you drill down too much into the use of your animal model, that people will not understand how that animal model works. Like if you're studying fruit flies and you're studying how fruit flies fly in a wind, that at some people you could say, oh, the silly scientists are studying these dumb things we don't care about why fruit flies fly in a wind. But that could have very important implications to muscle physiology, to neuroscience. There's lots of reasons that you could be doing that to study a big picture question. If you put too much detail, people will pull out what to the ignorant looks silly. Another reason is that, remember, these project summaries are the public face of your grant. If you provide too much detail, this can tell the general public, as well as your fellow scientists and competitors, exactly what you're working on. And generally, you want to be open and sharing, but do you really want everybody to have great detailed understanding of what you're studying? Because it's always possible someone will take that information and run with it and scoop you. The other thing is that
recording is on.
Hello? I think I just got somebody log in. If you could just mute yourself, that'd be great. So the next piece is that you want that this is the piece that will let the reviewers of your competing renewal know what the prior award was focused on. Now, it is normal for the scope of work to change over the course of a 4 to 5 year grant reward. That if you lay out in great detail every aim and sub-aim you're proposing, that then you're going to be obligated in the competing renewal to explain why you didn't do certain sub-aims or certain experiments. Now, the reason is likely because either new science came out to suggest a different approach, or your experimental results suggested you should change the focus of your work. But you really want to keep the scope. You want what people see as your scope of work to be as flexible as possible, so that you can count all scientific productivity coming from that funding towards the productivity of the competing renewal. So again, focus these project summaries on the big picture. Make sure that it's very, very clear what big picture problems you're studying, and put less emphasis on the technical details of how you're going to do it. Okay, so the next piece so right after the project summary in your grant application will be a statement called the public health relevance. Now, this was put into place pretty much directly because of things such as the Proxmire Award, or even more recent attacks on the scientific research enterprise. And this is extremely important, particularly for folks that are working on using basic model organisms to study big picture questions. That sometime when this was added, people took it as saying, oh, NIH is no longer interested in basic science research. That's absolutely not true at all. Every NIH institute has said they are very committed to funding basic science research. But this public health relevance statement is to try to head off at the pass these that all of these attacks that say that if you say I work on this particular model organism, that you are obligated to explain why somebody cares about what's going on in this model organism. This is also very, very important for social science research, because very often that the social science research particularly gets directly attacked by Congress, that it makes it sound like, oh, we're studying something self-evident. Well, if you can use this as your opportunity to explain why Congress should be funding this research and why the taxpayer should pay for it. That the public health relevance statements are very much looked at by the press, NIH administrative staff, and Congress, because this is the ammunition that is used to justify to Congress why NIH should be funded and why it shouldn't be cut. Now, this format, this is directly out of the NIH guidelines. This should be very short, 3 sentences. This is not for somebody who's going to read a huge amount of text. This is essentially a blurb so that somebody gets a brief understanding about why it's important to fund a particular project. And that this is short-term or long-term impacts, how it contributes to fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems, and or the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness or disability. So that sometimes people especially who are basic scientists, feel, oh, this is the BS statement. But the reason you're doing your research is that by understanding certain basic principles, it will really give us some insight into how to understand things that have direct application. For those of you who study clinical research or social science research, this is your opportunity to really say that this is an important problem and that this is going to help us get at either the mechanism or potential causes and treatment. These are directly used by NIH staffers who are responsible for communicating with Congress to sell the research portfolio. And they're also to try to educate people so that you don't someday have to defend your work publicly, who are to some sort of press person or some sort of person with an agenda that says that your work is ridiculous and should not be funded by the federal tax dollars. If we tell them ahead of time, and this might only take you 15 minutes or an hour to write, it might save you hours, days, or weeks defending your work later in the public sector. Okay, so is everybody good about the essentially the research abstract and the public health relevance? Do we have any questions at this point? Okay. So the next piece is the specific aims page. Very often when people write the specific aims page in the next session, the research plan, they think about them as one document, but they're really not. And actually, they're even uploaded completely separately into the grants database when you're preparing your application. The specific aims page is often the piece that that you're asked to think about or write first. And the reason is that you can consider this two ways. You can consider this as the outline of what you're going to write for the research plan, or you can also consider this as the full technical abstract of your research. While what we're putting in as the abstract tends to be very general, the specific aims page should be able to stand on its own independently without anybody reading the application. So its perfect crafting is really important. Now, the audience for the specific aims page is usually internal to NIH, even though people like your department chair may want to see this when they're doing your evaluations, or a potential collaborator may want to see this. This is the piece of the grant that the widest community of NIH decision makers are going to be reading. So this has to be very, very clear. One thing that I want to emphasize is that most decision makers who are going to decide about your grant will not be reading the research plan. They will at best be reading the specific aims. Those folks include scientific review officer. These are the people who these are the people, actually even before that, the people at input. These are the people who make the decision about which study section your grant is preliminarily assigned. The scientific review officer are the people who make study section assignments, and they're also the people who decide whether or not a grant assigned to them within the scope of their study section. The program officers, these are the people who make the funding decisions at the advice of the study section. This is the piece that study section members who are assigned to your grant will read first to make sure that the grant was within the scope of their expertise. But even more importantly, the specific aims page is the piece of the grant that almost everybody who's voting on the score of your grant will be reading, and it's the only piece. Because when a grant is reviewed, it's going to a study section that could consist of about 30 members. At the most, only 3 of those study section members will read your entire grant, specific aim, all of the pieces, including the specific aims page and the research plan. The other 27 members of the study section are going to be voting on the score of your grant. Most of them will only be skimming the specific aims page during the study section meeting. They will not be reading your entire grant. So this is your only chance to make an impression. And this is really important because if you have 3 people who are going to review your grant in depth, you might have one person give your grant a 1, another person give your grant a 3 or a 4, and that the study section members have to decide, are they going to vote with the person who thinks this grant's fabulous or with the person who thinks this grant is mediocre? Scanning the specific aims page is one way they're going to make that decision in addition to the arguments given at study section. They're also read by other NIH administrative staffers. And very importantly, they're also what's read by the Board of Scientific Counselors. So NIH considers itself to have a 2-tiered review system. There's the study section, which really reviews the grant in detail. But if you take a look at the timeline, you submit a grant by a deadline, there's a study section meeting, and then you'll always see another date. That's what's called council, or the Board of Scientific Counselors meeting. If your grant goes through study section, the program official will basically take every grant that went through the study section and make recommendations about whether a grant should be funded only if I have money, or not funded. The second tier of review is that the Board of Scientific Counselors reviews the program officer's recommendations. Now, in many cases, the Board of Scientific Counselors will concur. It's almost a rubber stamp. But there are many grants, particularly those in the fund if there's money category, where the Board of Scientific Counselors can move grants either into the definitely fund category, or even move grants that weren't necessarily recommended for funding into that fund if there's money. And the reason is that the Board of Scientific Counselors are very senior scientists in the field who have a big picture perspective of what's important. So they may, if they read a specific aims page that they say, this is absolutely critical information that we have to fund because it's not funding it is not moving the field forward, but it didn't get maybe a 1 at as an impact score. Those specific aims page are what's used to make those decisions. Similarly, a bad specific aims page could really hurt you in these secondary review decisions. So this is a very, very important piece. Like I said, this needs to be completely standalone, and it is only 1 page. So you can think of this as you're obligated to write a 1-page NIH grant. And that people use a number of different formats here. However, that in most cases, it's 1 page where there is an opening paragraph that sets up a scientific problem. There is a second paragraph that says that there are these particular scientific questions that we hypothesize have a particular set of answers. And this is very briefly our evidence that the hypothesis we're putting forth could be true. Then there's usually between 2 and 4 specific aims, which are the objectives that the grant is focused on answering. Now, why do you have to write it? That many of the people making decisions on your grants are making decisions on large numbers of grants. They don't have the time to read every single application. For your typical study section, between 80 and 100 grants are voted on by a study section of 30 people. All 30 people are not physically able to read all 100 grants. So this is the information that they're going to use in addition to the in-depth reviews to make their final voting decisions. So this is an extremely important piece of your NIH grant writing. And many people advise you to write the specific aims page first, and then use the specific aims page as your template or outline to write the rest of the application. So many of this I already said. It needs to be the freestanding document. It needs to clearly describe the problem, its significance, so that the reader can immediately understand who cares. This is the piece that almost every reviewer will read first, so this is your first impression. If the reviewer is bored after reading the specific aims page or thinks this is stupid, you've already lost the battle. It's unlikely you're going to convince them otherwise once they read the rest of the grant. It's also, for most research, it's critical to use the H word, the word hypothesis, preferably several times. That sometimes you will have an overarching hypothesis, and then you can state your specific aims as sub-hypotheses to be tested. But there's a lot of people who are very reluctant to use the hypothesis word, I think because folks find it somewhat like presumptuous to say that you have a particular hypothesis, but it's way better to state things as hypotheses to be tested than objectives to accomplish. It's just a more powerful way to state your specific aims. All right. So some other things that I usually tell people is that you want to avoid in-depth technical descriptions of how you're going to accomplish your aims. I will tell you that the reader does not want to hear about the Western blots. They want to understand the objectives and how accomplishing them will move the field forward. Now, as an example, one of my favorite articles in this realm that I've ever read is called Your Grant, the Rejected Recipe or the Funded Menu. And this is a really great analogy that says why you should not talk very much about the technical details of how you're going to test your hypothesis in your specific aims. Is that they use the analogy that you're going into a restaurant and somebody hands you a menu. Would you rather decide what you want to eat by the stack of recipes, or would you rather have the type of menu we do see, which is artisanally raised chicken in a roseberry Boer glaze. Or you could say dead gallus plucked and heated to a temperature of 300 degrees Fahrenheit with an extract of whatever the botanical name is of rosemary. That would not be something you would find appealing. The specific aims page is where you're really explaining to somebody why they should want this work. So sometimes it's actually better to put a little bit of more information about your preliminary data supporting your hypothesis in the aim on the aims page than it is necessarily to give a lot of detail of how you're going to test your hypothesis on the aims page. Now, one thing that's really important, and it's a mistake I've seen a lot in the years of grant review, is that you want to make very sure that the aims of the grant actually test the hypotheses stated. That what often happens is that people write the specific aims page as their outline, and then as they write the body of their grant, their experimental approach sort of morphs, and that in the end, they're not actually testing the stated hypothesis, or even that the stated aims in the body of the grant end up being different than the specific aims page. So yes, you write the specific aims page first, then you write the body of the grant, but then you should go back and reevaluate your written specific aims page and make sure those two documents are on the same topic even, because sometimes the body of the grant will morph so much that the specific aims page no longer reflects the grant. Also be extremely critical about whether your experimental design tests the stated hypothesis or a different hypothesis. And one thing to remember is that correlation does not equal causation. So make sure you're actually stating the hypothesis tested, because one way to kill a grant is to say, nice set of experiments, I can see how you'll get important information. But in the end, those experiments don't test the stated hypothesis. So you really want to avoid that trap. And that's a big way to do that, is to reassess what your aims say once you have your experimental plan written. Now, one thing that I will advise people is that folks have a short attention span. They're reviewing grants usually at the last minute, usually at the end of a long workday. Imagine your standard grant reviewer as somebody who's 50 years old with 2 kids they've been up late at their dance recital, and now it's 11 o'clock at night, and they have to get the reviews done the next day or two. So they're staying up to 3 o'clock in the morning reading grants and banging out reviews. That you have to keep in mind that you have to make stuff extraordinarily clear to people. You're not going to necessarily be getting them with their best, sharpest brain. And one way you can help this is that on the very end of your aims page, add a 1 to 2 sentence impact statement, even calling this impact. It should be a very short takeaway explaining how that proposed work moves the field forward. You want to be very explicit here. And the reason is that keep in mind that the score of an NIH grant is called the impact factor, or the impact score, and that when the grant goes to the study section, if somebody really likes your grant, and they give it a very high score, the other study section members are expecting that grant reviewer to be able to sell your work to the whole panel and justify the good score. So make it easy for that person to defend you. If you tell them exactly and explicitly why your work is important, they will have a way easier time both understanding it themselves, but also selling the importance of your work to the larger study section panel. Okay? So do I have any questions about formulating specific aims pages at this point? Okay. So the last piece I'm going to talk about is the research plan. The research plan is what most of us are going to spend the vast majority of our time on. It, for the most part, will be the biggest direct score driver. that NIH has been using these criterion scores for 7 or 8 years now. They have done retrospective studies, and that the score given to the research plan tends to correlate very, very strongly with the overall impact score the grant will receive. So it's really important to make a great case in the research plan. Its audience is very limited, though. To be honest, that it's probably only going to be read in depth by the 3 assigned reviewers for the grant. It's unlikely that any of the other people who are going to touch or make decisions about your grant are going to read this in depth. The only reason they may is that there's certain mixed signals in the way the review goes. They might go back and read the research plan in some depth. Which also means that the research plan needs to be set up in a format that could be easily skimmed by others. While the actual reviewers are going to read this in depth, even people who are going back and checking something in the research plan are likely to only skim it. So this means that sometimes you have to be quite repetitive. You have to maybe restate abbreviations in multiple sections, because it's unlikely that somebody's going to read as a 12-page single-space document. Few people are going to read this from the first word to the last word straight through. So you really want to make sure that it's internally consistent, as well as it's easy to understand each individual piece independently. Its format is 3 sections: significance, innovation, and approach. There's 2 ways to design this. You could have each specific aim have a significance and innovation or approach section. That's actually set in the guidelines. But what most people do is that they have an overarching significance and overarching innovation. And then in the approach section, that the aim, specific significance, and innovation are also highlighted. Now, this is written because this is the meat of the proposal. This really explains the details of what you're proposing in depth, why anybody should care, and how this work will move the field forward. And like I said, that the research plan is the piece that the reviewers will largely use to determine your impact scores. So the significance portion of this. This is the opportunity to elaborate on the big picture scientific question. It's also the introduction into the field. Unfortunately, because of the limited length of NIH grants, you can't give a complete big picture literature review. This is actually a really good reason that if you know you're going to be writing a grant in 6 months to a year, to write a really big picture literature review on the area that you are studying and submit that to a journal. Because if you can have the significance section be, let's say, a 1-page description of why we care about the scientific area, and you can refer to a major review that you have written that really summarizes what's going on in the area, that can really strengthen what both your expertise, and it can also allow the reviewer who wants to get some more background information an easy place to get it. Now, when you write the significance section, it's really important to know who could be reading it. In the last class, I talked about finding out who's the permanent member of the study sections who are going to be reviewing your grant, really putting yourself into those persons' shoes and presenting information that the reviewer pool will buy. So very often our research touches many areas. What you need to sell to a developmental biologist is going to be different than what you might sell to a clinician treating pediatric disease, which is different to what you might have to sell to a geneticist or a bioinformatician. So by having a clear view of the type of scientist who will review your grant can really help you understand how to make the best arguments necessary for the significance. Now, I usually tell people it's a bad idea to sell the significance of all of your aims here. And the reason is that it's really hard to keep information in short-term memory through the significance and through all of your aims. Also, because of the length of the grant, the reviewer might not be reading it in one sitting. They might be sitting in doing student office hours for teaching. They started reading the grant, somebody comes in for a question, they leave, they keep reading the grant. And it's unlikely that somebody's going to remember a point made by significance in the significance section when they're reading the individual aim. So what I usually tell people is the significance section should focus on the big picture significance, but that in each individual aim, you need to sell the significance of that aim locally within the aim. Now, the length, I usually tell people to keep this as a single page, that most of this is, the detail is kept in the approach section. I usually also tell people to minimize the preliminary data you put in the significance section. It can usually be way more effective to put the preliminary data supporting the need to do an experiment right before you describe the experiment. It's, again, give people the information in the order you need it instead of front-loading all of the preliminary data in the significance section. It just tends to be more effective when you actually think about how people learn and how people gather information. That if you wrote this well, you will convince your reader, though, that the area is important and that there are critical knowledge gaps that must be filled. Okay. The next section is a reasonably short section, but it's actually important to write, and very often people don't put enough effort into writing a good innovation section. The reason that this is really important is that it is a scorable criteria for NIH grant proposals. While when you actually look at the correlation between the innovation score and the final score, the correlation's reasonably small. However, the reason that innovation is meant to be a scorable criteria, it's meant to prime the reviewers to really think about whether or not a grant is innovative or not before going to the next step of giving the final score. So it certainly influences it. Now, for innovation, there's many ways a grant can be innovative. The biggest way, of course, is innovative technologies. So if you have developed this cutting-edge innovative technology that allows you to answer a question nobody has been able to before, that's, of course, a no-brainer in innovation. But you can also talk about innovation in the sense of how an application challenges or seeks to shift current research or clinical practice paradigms. You could talk about how there's theoretical concepts, approaches, or methods. You can also talk about how the grant will refine, improve, or allow for theoretical concepts, approaches, instrumentation, interventions. You can really be creative about explaining why your grant isn't Me Too research. Something that can really kill a grant is if the impression is, well, we already know that this is operative in these 5 diseases. Do we really need to know if it's operative in that 6th disease or in that 6th tissue? So that kind of Me Too research, can be critically important, but if it's already known as a basic biological mechanism, it's not going to excite the reviewers. So you need to explain explicitly why this is important. Now, the innovation section has no specific explicit length in the application instructions. However, I usually combine this explicit innovation statement to 4 to 6 sentences. And if you do your job well, you will have convinced the reviewers that the work is innovative, and they might even paraphrase the wording that you use to describe that. And that's actually a good thing, because that means that they have completely bought your argument and again have the ammunition they need to defend your work in front of the large study section panel. So any questions about the innovation section of an NIH grant? Okay. So the very last piece is the approach piece. And this is the meat of the grant, and it describes what you're really going to be doing. Now, you have the overall aim or objective that you talked about in the specific aims page. That's the first thing you're going to want to write down. That's your global hypothesis. Generally, it's good to then immediately give the background and preliminary data supporting the hypothesis, even weave in a restatement of the significance about why somebody should be doing this. Now, you then want to explain what experiments will be done to test the hypothesis. I usually find that this is best described as sub-aims. So maybe the specific aim is, I can actually use a specific aim from my grant, is to test the role of alpha V integrin in the disease posterior capsular opacification. That's the overall aim. But each sub-aim will be what different experiments that are going to be done to test that hypothesis. Now, for each sub-aim, you should give explicitly describe what would the data look like if the hypothesis is supported or if the hypothesis is rejected, and say explicitly how you will move forward if the hypothesis is rejected. Very often people writing grants say, well, I'm going to do a certain experiment, and they think that the results are going to be, it's going to be self-evident to the reviewer how those results will look and how the different possible experimental outcomes will support or refute the hypothesis. However, remember again, you think about this particular project all the time. The grant reviewer is going to give you an hour at their time at the most to look at what you're doing. They're likely going to be doing it when their brain isn't fresh, when they've had a long day. So even though your reviewers are expert, you're more expert in this work than they are. So you have to explicitly walk them through why a particular experimental outcome how that will reflect on the truth or not of your hypothesis. And the failure to do that can be really, really damaging to how the reviewer thinks of your grant. Another thing is each aim you should give the pitfalls and alternative approaches. So every experiment has a pitfall. That could either be a reason the experiment didn't work. In my Western blot example, it could be your antibody didn't work. But it could also be ways that you could be fooled or certain experimental limitations. One thing that isn't a pitfall is that you might mess up the experiment. I once read a grant where the applicant actually said, well, this experiment's going to be done by an early career grad student and they may mess up the experiment. And the alternate approach would be to have them repeat the experiment. That person completely missed what's involved with pitfalls. There can be real reasons that maybe what's going on is more complicated, so you can't interpret the data. Or that the antibody doesn't work, or there's a lot of possible pitfalls. If you're in a clinical study, maybe you're going to have some trouble with patient recruitment or people turning in their third feedback questionnaire. So under that case, that you want to have alternate approaches. You want to say, I know this is a potential weakness in this experimental design. If I encounter that weakness, I will go to this alternate experimental design. And by saying it explicitly, especially as an early career investigator where you're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt, you will have a way to show, I'm really sophisticated, I'm not naive, I understand the problems I may run into, but I know if I run into these problems, I will handle it. The reason you want to write that is you don't want the reviewer to say, oh, this is really naive, they're going to have trouble with this, and they don't seem to know, and they don't seem to be sophisticated enough to know what to do when that doesn't work out. So again, be very specific here. Now, another thing is to avoid what's called dependent aims. That And when you're writing, very often when you're thinking about a project, that you might have the first aim be to analyze a certain result. And then you want the second aim is once you know that answer, you're going to do X, Y, Z. Well, what if aim one fails? Maybe you're working with an animal model that didn't actually model the disease of interest. Maybe that you weren't able to, there's a lot of reasons that a specific aim can fail. That if the second aim is dependent on the first aim's success, that can really kill a grant. Because even if the second aim makes sense, its dependence on the first aim means, well, what if the first two experiments in the first aim don't work out? It kills the whole grant. They have nothing to do. So you want the specific aims to generally be able to stand on their own. So you don't run into that problem where the grant reviewer says, oh, aim two is dependent on aim one. And, you know, if that, I think that's a risky experiment in aim one. And if that doesn't work, the whole grant's toast. You want to make it so the grant reviewers can't say that. Now, from the standpoint of length, there is none explicitly given, but the entire research plan is 12 pages. And since I can find significance to innovation of 1.3 pages, it's typically on my grants 10.7 pages long. Now, it's also very important to be very explicit explaining how the results obtained will prove or dispose the hypothesis. Be extremely objective and critical when you're writing this. One really big thing is that people writing grants confuse correlation with causation. So that be explicit saying that a certain result correlates, that the hypothesis is correct. Only attribute causation if you've directly proven it. You also don't want to overinterpret those experiments. That it's very, very common that the reviewers will feel that the experiments don't accomplish the stated goal. So you need to really be clear how the experiments accomplish the goal. And it's really easy for this to be incorporated into the writing, because very often people will write their goals first and then design the experiments, but then never go back and critically evaluate whether the experiments accomplish the goal. Sometimes the experiments make sense, and what you need to be doing is rewriting or restating the goal. But this internal consistency is critical in a grant application. Similarly, when you're writing your significance section, if you oversell that a certain piece of information is needed while the rest of the grant doesn't study that problem, it's sort of bait and switch. And the reviewer's like, well, they said that this was what was important, but they're studying this. I don't get it. So make sure that all of your logic hangs together internally very, very well. Another thing that must be included in the approach, which is new from last year, is that grants are now expected to directly address how the integrity of the reagents, animals, cell lines, antibodies, etc., and reproducibility of experiments is ensured. So this is also in the approach you want to really talk about the statistical plan. And the other thing that as you're developing your approach, you want to write it in such a way so it's clear to the reviewer how this overall project, and this can be unpublished preliminary data, plus the proposed experiments will result in a publication, or more than one publication preferably. That sometimes that there's this nice set of scientific logic, but in the end, the reviewer's left with, well, this seems like kind of hanging out there. How are they going to publish this? So you want to think about, have you proposed enough work to actually result in a research product like a publication? So the other thing that you want to include in an approach is that if you're in the early stages of development, describe strategies to establish feasibility, address management of high-risk aspects to the proposed work. You also need to talk about anything that's hazardous or precautions. If you're working with select agents, that needs to be in there. Now, some of this is addressed in separate sections. For instance, if you're working with humans, the human subjects protections do have its own section. but you need to be very, very clear in the approach, that you're also, all of these pieces are in place. The approach is also where you would include information on power analysis to really convince people that you are proposing to study enough patients. And those of you who are doing any research involved with patient enrollment or sample enrollment, especially since many of us work on rare diseases, you need to be able to explicitly say how many patients are being seen based on what you know about patient recruitment, what percentage of the patients coming to the clinic are going to be willing to enroll in your trial, and that you have to show you have access to sufficient patients or patient material to actually meet what's needed in the power analysis to really hit statistical significance. Also, at the end of each aim and your entire approach section, you should have independent impact statements. So at the end of your aim, your first aim, have the impact of that aim. At the end of the second aim, have the impact of that aim. And make sure that the very last thing that the reviewer reads is a very positive, upbeat impact statement to state why this work should be done. There's a tendency of writing grants that the very last thing you talk about in an aim is a pitfall. That means the last thing that reviewer is going to be reading is something negative about the work. You want to make sure the last thing they read is something positive, because after they stop reading, they're going to start writing. And you want to manage the psychology of the reviewer in such a way to maximize the chances that they're going to write things that are more positive than negative. Okay, so do I have any specific questions about the research plan from anybody? Okay, so with that, I'm just going to wrap up with some final thoughts. The first is that naive grant writers, early career grant writers, hear that they have to write a 12-page single-space proposal, 13 counting the aims, and think that is really long. However, when I was starting out, NIH R01 applications were 25 pages. And after it went to 12 pages, those of us who've been writing grants for a long time actually find 12 pages almost impossibly short. And that's because there are such high expectations of how many different things we have to sell and explain. 12 pages single-spaced for a grant in a case of an R01, that might be research that many people are going to work on for 5 years with $1 to $3 million total budgets. It's really not a lot of space to get everything you want to say across. And this is even tougher because NIH keeps adding new requirements to address without changing the number of pages. The most recent one is the addition of the requirement that sex is a biological variable. That requirement to specifically address this was added with no change in the page limits, which means is that the length, the space you have to explain other things related to your science has just decreased. So what I recommend to people, and I found this is crucial, is that you write the first draft with no regard to page limits. And fully expect that you're going to need significantly more than 12 pages for your first draft to actually touch on everything that NIH is expecting and that the grant reviewers are going to need to be hearing. You know, it could, the last R01 I submitted back in February, my first draft of it was probably close to 18 pages long. And that's how much I had to write to be able to get everything that needed to be said, as well as to show all of the preliminary data in figure form that I want to show. Now, that I then spent 2 weeks on my later drafts, polishing the wording of my grant and really editing for length and clarity and specificity. And this is because most people write their first drafts of a scientific paper or grant extremely redundantly. I do read a lot of graduate student work. It's not unusual for somebody to say the same thought 3, 4, 5 times over 2 paragraphs. If you are trying to write for length, what happens is that important stuff never gets written in the first place. So it's not there to be edited into a very, very tight, concise, well-reasoned argument. This means that the final grant is missing key information and does not score well. Another thing that most people do is write in passive voice. Generally, the tendency is to write, "It has been shown that." Well, you know what? You can say that as "it is." But don't self-edit when you're writing your first draft. It's much more important to get all your ideas on paper first, and then go and clean up all of that sort of passive voice and all of this other language. Because if you keep yourself to concise writing in the first draft, that's a really quick way to get writer's block. Just write free form, get all the information down, and then do an explicit editing process that cleans it all up. And there's actually an article that's attached to the information that Erin posted that's called "Polishing Your Prose by Needless Word." And what's great about that article is that it actually starts with, I think, an entire page of text, and it actually edits down to 1 line. And it's just showing how most of what was written there was just filler words, redundancies, lacking in information. And because the NIH grant is so short, you don't have time to provide redundant information. And pretty much every other grant mechanism out there is even shorter. So my take-home recommendation is get everything that needs to be included to sell it to somebody who doesn't know your work down on paper, then do the brutal, brutal editing. And you will find that you will write much better grants than if you try to write to 12-page length. So with that, I think that's my last slide. So I can open it up for questions if anybody has any big picture questions, or you're also always welcome, of course, to essentially ask me questions in person, or you can also always send me an email if you have questions that have come up. So any questions for anybody online? Okay, so I'm not getting anybody who's asking questions. So next month's presentation is going to be on all of the other stuff in a grant. A really big mistake people make is that they leave that for last. And I will tell you, it's almost the stuff that you should be doing first while you are composing, because it tends to be relatively easy to write, and you're not going to want to be, but you also have to put a lot of attention to it, and you don't want to be dealing with your environment pages when what you really want to be doing is fine-tuning your research plan. I believe we also have somebody coming in from the Moore's Grants Administration who can also talk about some of the back stuff that happens with NIH Grant Administration. And the other thing that I'd just like to, I believe Erin sent around to the Junior Investigator Network, NIH has these regional workshops on the entire grants process from cradle to grave. And there's one that was just announced that's going to be in Baltimore in October. And I took a course like this when I was still an NIH postdoc 20-some years ago. And just understanding everything that goes on behind the scenes with the NIH grant process is something that I personally found extraordinarily helpful as I was writing my first R01. So that's something that if you can get away for, I think it's 2 or 3 days in October, I would really recommend you do it. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next month.